Okay, today is Friday, June 16th. The readings for today come from Romans 5 and Matthew 9. So, Romans 5, I have highlighted here: one man's act of righteousness leads to acquittal and life for all men. By one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. So, within the psychological context, what has been happening over the last 2,000 years, according to some continental psychologists, is the increasing withdrawal of projection and the reduction in the so-called mystical participation with the environment. And so this may be most easily conceptualized as if you consider what it would be like to be an early human being who encounters a world but also encounters their thoughts, both of which may appear alien, and the latter of which may be ascribed to the former. So one way to think about this might be that upon perception of a tree and the thought that there may be something hiding in the tree, or the possibility of a sound of an animal coming from the tree, right? So this is so-called primitive consciousness doing some predictive type cognitive stuff. In the early human consciousness, there was no distinction between the sound or anticipation of the animal in the mind and the tree itself. And so there is some sense in which we might say, for example, that early human beings would ascribe to the tree the sound or thought or image. And so the tree was alive with the mental contents of the human being. So over time, an increasing distinction was made between thought and environment. And this increasing distinction, whereby the thought is pulled away from the environment and properly located in the mind of the individual, this is what is known as the withdrawal of projection. And so the argument is that this has been happening with the religious traditions as well, and what we read here in Romans is an example of mystical participation in the event of Golgotha. And so what I would say is happening here is what is understood in the Christian religion as the revelation of Christ on the cross, or the revelation of God in the world, is understood according to psychological developments to be a revelation of God in man himself. And so the cognitive event that occurred in the witnesses of the crucifixion and subsequent activities is in the Christian religion understood according to this manner of mystical participation, which we are provided with evidence to impel us to withdraw that projection and to see the crucifixion as, in some sense, initiating a cognitive event in our own minds. And so the revelation of God is instigated by, but is not mystically equivalent to, the crucifixion itself. And so Christ is the outer event that triggers the inner revelation of man's own nature. And this brings what this revelation is a heightened self-consciousness. And so this is often compared with the way in which self-consciousness developed within the human species. There are some theories that suggest that the development of self-consciousness in human species is a adaptive mating technique, essentially, and so the male encounter with the female occasions a heightened self-consciousness of the male, because self-consciousness in the male would be associated with all kinds of improvements in reproductive behaviors and attractiveness in mating. And so the suggestion is that this same process found a sort of a very full expression in the crucifixion, which occasioned a heightening of self-consciousness among those who know the story, etc. So that self-consciousness is not in Christ any more than my own consciousness is in Christ, but rather the work of Christ that we read in Romans. The work of Christ occasions a heightening of my own self-consciousness and a revelation of that manner in which God is present in me that I was able to recognize because of the events of Christ. So the argument is essentially here that it is not that the crucifixion gives us something new, but rather allows us to recognize something in us that we would not have been able to recognize had it not been in us. And that's the argument for it being in us, is how could we possibly know something if it wasn't already in us? And so you make a similar line of argumentation around mathematics, and you would say something like, we wouldn't understand the structure of reality if that structure wasn't already part of our cognition, and this is the synthetic a priori that we discussed yesterday. Okay, so Matthew, the part I'm going to read here is, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? So this is just a kind of a fun little question about the Pharisees are fasting, but Jesus and his disciples are not fasting, and so the question is, why are the proto-Christians not fasting if the Jews are fasting? And Jesus is written here to have said, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? So there's no need to fast because the good times are here. The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away, and then they will fast. So fasting is something you do in bad times. So the psychological reading of this is, I guess, as follows. Disintegration from extroversion is resolved through introversion. And so there's a second example here that's not highlighted, but it has to do with, you don't put a new piece of cloth on an old garment. You have to shrink the cloth first, and then you attach it. So the idea is something like, you have to bring the large down to the small in order to repair. Something like that. So let me just say a little bit more about extroversion and disintegration and introversion. Extroversion is disintegration to the extent in which extroversion relates to outer objects, and so there's a broadening or expanding of consciousness to include, perceive, understand, comprehend, apperceive the objects of the outer world. And to the extent that we attempt to interact with, modify, augment the outer world, there is a broadening of consciousness, a thinning of consciousness, and a disintegration of consciousness as it goes out from itself into the world. That same broadening, thinning, disintegration, when applied to oneself, just simply does not occur because the modification, the attempt at modification, manipulation, augmentation, does not consequence a disintegration of the self of oneself or one's feeling of being when the contents are oneself, because the referent is oneself, and so there's no change or expansion or disintegration when the contents over which the mind is occupied is itself. Okay, and so I think this is a very short story that I don't think is easily interpreted, but I do want to say, I'll actually wind up wanting to say quite a bit about the meaning of this for things like theodicy and the reason and nature of suffering. Now, thinking about and applying this concept of extroverted disintegration to theodicy. So if God is, in the first place, the absolute witness of the universe, which underlies and is the possibility of all awareness, then how much more might we blame him for his withdrawn observation, or in a critical attitude we might call a voyeurism? How much more if he not only sees, but determines, allows, and even wills it? And so what we're talking about here is bad things. How could us creatures not react in horror and in anger at such a creator? lest one creature say that this anger is not towards God, but towards the faces one's very creatureliness places over him. That this anger is the friction before the light of one's self-transformation, and is only one's own, suggests that, face to face with the anger of another, one works out one's own more benevolent vision. But does this not justify our idolatrous anger, or violence, or the perpetuation of abuse, if my anger towards another is that other's own being reflected to them? Is my anger not a most welcome service, a sacrifice I make against myself, or does this lead only to resignation? Yet only when I, in the reflection of my own anger back to me, in the violence done against me, reflect back only my deepest witness, do I, because it is not my own, bear witness to the highest witness, and in his witness know that witness is always already love, and in this love know that no evil is willed towards me. Only then do I see disintegration as the deepest expression of my love and concern, and in the violence done to me, the loving disintegration of my persecutor, who severs themselves from themselves, that I might fashion myself in the shape of their deficit. And so the Son of God is begotten as the image of the Father's act of sacrificial disintegration.